something that happens to me, and I'm sure it happens to most people, is that you'll get to the end of a really sad movie, and you'll find yourself crying. And what you're doing is you're not mourning what happened during the movie. The movie has brought out the pain that you've accumulated all your life, all the losses you've ever suffered. That's what you're crying about. And in fact, as you learn what causes this suffering, you're going to experience it again in the future. You're going to lose more loved ones in the future. You're going to be injured more grievously in the future. So you're grieving and you're reacting to both the past and the future. And this is where time comes in. I had to prepare for it because, you asked me if I were comfortable in talking about this. And frankly, I'm not comfortable talking about it, but I will talk about it anyway. And I don't know what's going to happen as a result. When I met with my friend the next morning, the tribal elder, the first thing he did was give me a gift. And the gift he gave me was, and he didn't really even know what I was doing out there, but he had been somehow inspired to give me this little rattle. It was like a little toy rattle. And the rattle is what those people use to mark time when they sing their songs. It's what he uses as a singer in his tribe to mark time when he sings a song. And it's what I would have had if I had been from those people and I had been singing songs at that ceremony. So it all just fell into place, one thing after another. It was like most of my experiences in the desert. It was magical, but it was inevitable. It was guided by the spirit of that place. I feel like I have some distance now, and that might help me, or it might not. The subject. I think that the way I'd like to start is to try to portray the subject so it'll be clearer what we're talking about, because we come to this as colonists, as Europeans. Basically, we come to it from a certain perspective, which involves certain habits, certain ways of behaving around the subject. And so I want to clarify that, as you mentioned, we're talking about loss. So that was the ceremony, and that was behind your question, asking me to talk about this subject. And I think from that there's some takeaways. Our response to that as individuals or as communities or as societies or cultures. And specifically, we're talking about death, which is the ultimate loss. And these are subjects that are really difficult to talk about. They involve grievous injury to the survivors. And we're talking about heartbreak. We're talking about pain that's in some ways the worst imaginable pain that we can imagine. I mean, you can imagine, and I've experienced severe physical pain. First of all, grieving is an individual thing, but you should never have to grieve alone. It's something that you need to share with your community, and that your community needs to share with you. Because as we agreed, I think at the beginning, this is one of the most difficult experiences you can have as a human being. You should not have to go through it alone. So that's what the ceremony is about. The emotional pain I felt when I experienced this sort of loss, for example, the death of a loved one, that will go up to a 10 on that pain scale for sure. And and so whether or not the audience as individuals has experienced that kind of pain, um, they can probably understand that your response to that pain, when it's unexpected, when it happens suddenly, it hits you, um, it's going to be some extreme form of response. And your society may not allow you to respond in that way. There are a lot of benefits to a ceremony like this. There's the sharing of grief. There's the ability to bring that grief out, to bring that deep feeling out, and to express it in a safe place. I thought a lot about this experience of loss and my trajectory, my story with that experience going way back from the traumas that I experienced in childhood to the losses that I've experienced throughout my life as my loved ones have passed away. Um, it's happened over and over again, which I think is the way we all experience that loss. It accumulates throughout our lives. And that's where these real problems come in, problems of suppressing your emotions, of living in denial of what's happened. And I just want to make clear that this is one of the most extreme experiences that we can have as human beings. And at some point, we either acknowledge it or we don't. And our society may or may not prepare us for acknowledging that pain, that suffering, that injury. And that's what we're really talking about here. So when I was asked to lead this ceremony out there for this loved one who died, um, she died last August, so almost a year ago. And because her loved ones, her family lived all over the world, we had to plan this ceremony far in advance. We all did our grieving after she died 10 months ago. We did our grieving, and I grieved heavily. It took me weeks to get over that. My whole life was pretty much sidelined while I was grieving. I never expected to be hit that hard. But then all this time passed. As the time approached, I began planning and preparing. And one of the things I prepared was music, with songs. Katie, my friend, she and I had been songwriting partners. I started going through my records, my archives, preparing for this ceremony, and I found a whole file full of lyrics that she had written. Many of them she'd written before me. She met me, and some of them she wrote after she met me. And most of those lyrics had never been used. And so I realized in the months before going out to the desert to perform this ceremony, I realized that these represented an opportunity for me to prepare for the ceremony and to get closer to her, to get closer to her memory and her legacy. And I came across, the most interesting thing was, like, most of them she had typed up, and she had titles and she had her name down below, and but there was one that was just a manuscript, a handwritten manuscript that she had scrawled on a piece of scrap paper. And she had obviously written it when we were camping out. The two of us were camping together. And she was writing this song to me. And it was not necessarily finished, it was not polished. She was just scrawling the lyrics and writing this song to me. And so I realized that was the one I had to start with. And it went really smoothly and really quickly. And I put that song to music and I recorded it. And then I found another set of lyrics that I remember that she had wanted me to work on with her, and I had never worked on it while she was alive. So I realized that was the next one I had to work on. So I put that song to music. And I thought, what am I going to do when I go out there? I'm expected to lead this ceremony. How am I going to do it? How's it going to unfold? There are certain things I knew that we would have to do. Um, But when they asked me, her family got in touch with me a week or two before the ceremony, and they said, well, what are we going to do, Max? What's your plan? And I said, I don't know. I don't have a plan. Death that accumulates. It's not like you ever recover. It's always there inside you. It's this sort of wound that goes deeper and deeper and accumulates over time. Obviously, one way you might be able to process it is in this sort of group community ceremony. Let's just meet out there and let's just see what happens. I went out there early and I made my own sort of ritual journey through the landscape. And I met her family out there and I led them out there. We drove across the desert to this place. Part of the reason why I fell in love with this place originally, and my friends fell in love with it, is that it's when you approach it from the highway, from the road, it's like a sort of like a natural amphitheater. But there are other ways in which you can use that. You can take that experience of loss and you can turn it into something positive, into an experience, into an opportunity, into an experience of gain, something that enriches your life. She had nieces and nephews who knew her in a completely different way from the way I knew her. They knew her as their wonderful aunt, somebody outside their immediate family who was connected to them, who could inspire them. And they really knew nothing about her creative work. And so what I could share with them about her creative work, because she was a brilliant artist in many ways. She was somebody who inspired me and many other people in the arts. And they knew nothing about that. And so by sharing her work, her music, her visual art, her writing with them, I could inspire them. And I think in general, that example can inspire young people not to bury their feelings, not to bury the feelings of loss or the feelings of injury or the feelings of suffering they have, but to express them and get them out there. That's one of the things that art does for us. It allows us to share these deep feelings, often these painful feelings that society discourages us from sharing. I started the ceremony by telling the story of how I discovered the place originally, which was a life-changing experience. And it was a moving experience. And it helped them to visualize how this place looked to us when we first discovered it. I showed it to them. It's a cave. You go down into it. It's a rock shelter and a boulder pile. And one by one, these people from all over the world went down in there and looked at it themselves. And as they came out of the cave, they told me, now we understand. Now we understand why you and Katie fell in love with this place and why it inspired you the way it did. And it was because it's an intimate space. It wasn't the appropriate place for us to be hanging out. And I had discovered at the last minute that these people did not want to just do a ceremony out there. They wanted to spend the entire day out there because it had taken us a couple hours out to drive out to that place. And they just they didn't want to just go there and do it and leave, you know. They wanted to spend the whole day out there. So I had picked another place for them that where we would have shade and a larger pile of boulders and it would accommodate the whole group. And so we went over there. So the big positive that I got out of that ceremony was that I could help to share her creative legacy and to inspire other people to express themselves in that way. There's a lot more that I could say about it, but I've been talking for a long time and I feel like you probably deserve a we spent the day in that public place, um, alternating between socializing and eating and drinking and so forth, and coming together to to tell stories of our experiences with Katie, this person that we were memorializing. Um, so we all cried. We all cried. We were beginning to break up. We were going to. Some people wanted to go outside and sit in the sun and listen to music on their boombox, and other people wanted to hang out in the shade and close their eyes and just sort of listen to the bird song in the background and so forth. But as we were breaking up, her brother said, "Max, um, what about the songs? Um, you and Katie wrote songs together. Don't you want to play some of those songs for us?" And I said, "Yes, I have to." And so I had brought my little travel guitar, and I got the guitar out, and I didn't feel comfortable doing the lyrics from memory. It turned out I was okay anyway, but I had brought the lyrics on on paper just in case. And so I found a branch of a juniper bush to set the lyrics on. To describe where we were, it's a pile of huge boulders that have sort of fallen together, and it's this like vaulted sort of chapel-like, church-like space, and there's an old gnarled juniper running through the middle of it, and boulders of various sizes lying around, and people are sort of gathered in a circle back in the corner of this area, surrounded by the juniper tree and the boulders. And so I'm standing on the edge there with my guitar and my lyrics, and I sang Katie's songs, and these are songs that Katie wrote, and songs that I put to music for her after her death, about responding to nature in the way that was special to the two of us, with this passion and curiosity and love. Of course, I broke down in the singing, and they were all crying again. And this is the kind of ceremony it was. We would all be hanging out, and one of the women would come to me and say, "Max, don't you think we should start with the next stage?" And I said, "Yes, I guess so." And so then I would sort of gather people together, and we would start on to the next stage of it. So it was just incredibly organic and something that could never have been planned. Um, at the end of the day, the sun was going down, and some of the men were starting to worry about how long it was going to take to get back to, where they were staying, back to their lodging, and being able to get there before dark and being able to find their way. And so we proceeded to the final part of the ceremony, and that was, it's not something I want to describe apart from saying that it was the women who formed the core of it. All the women in the group came and formed a tight circle around us, and they were the ones that I asked for a consensus on exactly how we were going to do this. And this was something that occurred once again essentially in wilderness, in a place where indigenous people had camped out for more generations than anyone could know. And when it was over, we all said our goodbyes back at the road. They wanted me to go back with them, but I said, "No, I can't. What I need to do next is I need to go and meet with my friend, the tribal elder." I didn't plan on doing that. I had certainly considered it in advance, but not as part of the ceremony. I had just thought, well, I'm going to be out there. I should go see my friend. But when that ceremony was over, I knew that was the next thing I had to do. And so the sun was going down, and I saw them all driving off into the distance, and waving back out of the car windows. And then I got in my car, and I thought, I'd better call my friend and make sure he's there. And so I called him, and he said sure, and he agreed to get me into their hotel that they had back there. And so I got to the hotel. It was almost a 3-hour drive for me. It was a long drive, and got there late at night. And on the way, it had occurred to me that I had read something decades ago, 30 or 40 years before. I had read something about a ceremony that his people had. And I thought it was called the cry, which is, what else could you call it? You're getting together to cry. Um, so when I got to my room and I got my Wi-Fi and I went online and sure enough, I found the exact passage that I had read about that ceremony. And I read about it. And in the passage, what they described was more or less the ceremony that we had. There were some additional steps that they did that we could not have done. And I don't know how much I want to say about that ceremony, that traditional ceremony, because I'm not part of that culture. But the elements of that ceremony that were identical to the elements of our ceremony were planning in advance so that the whole community could attend, people who are scattered all over the landscape. So unlike the typical Anglo or European funeral, this was an event that was planned far in advance. It was not the burial ceremony that occurred, right after death that we usually have. It was planned far in advance, and invitations were sent out, gifts were shared. In fact, I brought gifts. I've made up scrapbooks about my friend in the desert, her time in the desert with me. Like me, she was a musician, she was a visual artist, and she was a writer. And so I put together a big scrapbook of all of her work that I had to pass out to everyone who was there. So we share gifts, and that's part of the traditional ceremony. In the traditional ceremony, each person owns a song or songs, and those songs are sung at the ceremony. And that's what I did. So when I read that passage and realized that it was somewhere buried deep in my memory, but it was also something that was embedded in the landscape from time immemorial and brought there by these people and maintained by these people who were our predecessors in that landscape. It just floored me. I was out in the desert and I had been camping out in the wilderness where there was no cell signal with a bunch of friends. And I came out of the mountains and I got the signal, and I was driving to an airport to drop off one of my friends. But as soon as I got that signal, I got a voicemail from my mother who told me that my father had died. And I pulled off the road and I got out of that vehicle and I ran out into the desert and I threw myself on the ground and I just began screaming. But where could you do that in civilization? You just couldn't get away with it. And this is where time comes in and how our society thinks and behaves around time, and where indigenous people help us immeasurably. Because time is not, there is no such thing as time. There are only human experiences that we sort of group into this one word that really is meaningless. We, unfortunately, our science has turned time into a one-dimensional variable that goes into mathematical equations. And that's preposterous. That doesn't describe how time works. We've done things institutionally in our culture. We've turned time into a mechanical concept. Some people talk about it as linear time, but what it is a form of social control, and it also underlies many of the institutions in our society, which, as I've said before, are very destructive both to us and to nature. Indigenous people know that time is a whole suite, a whole complex of phenomena, ways in which we experience nature. We have cyclical time. We have the day-night cycle. We have the lunar cycle that's owned by women in many ways. We have the cycle of the seasons, which plays out in different ways in different habitats because some people live on the equator. Some people live in the southern hemisphere. Some people live in the northern hemisphere. People live in the Arctic, the Antarctic, the different habitats which experience the seasons differently. So it's not one simple thing. It's not the four seasons. It's not that old cliche. And then we have long cycles of catastrophes and calamities in our environment, in our habitats. And then we also have this concept of simultaneous time, which pertains directly to what I've experienced surrounding the loss of my friend. She's still alive in my life, and her work lives as part of her legacy. And that, I think, is something that can inspire us when we lose other people. We can realize that they're still alive in us. They're still alive in their work. As artists, my friend was childless. I'm childless. My work as an artist, as a musician, my songs are my children. My artworks are my children. And that's true for her too. She didn't end when she died. Her life goes on in her legacy, in the people who remember her, and in the work that she left to the rest of us. And this is another way of experiencing time, what we call time. I had a vision once um, where I saw the surface of a lake, and everyone that I knew was rising up to that surface. The light was shining on them briefly, and then they were going back under the surface. That's what human experience is. It's human consciousness is like the surface of a lake. And when I met with my friend the next morning, the tribal elder, the first thing he did was give me a gift. And the gift he gave me was, and he didn't really even know what I was doing out there, but he had been somehow inspired to give me this little rattle. And the rattle is what those people use to mark time when they sing their songs. It's what he uses as a singer in his tribe to mark time when he sings a song. And it's what I would have had if I had been from those people and I had been singing songs at that ceremony. So it all just fell into place, one thing after another. It was like most of my experiences in the desert. It was magical, um, but it was inevitable. It was guided by the spirit of that place and by the ancestors of the people who lived out there.